from CERN.
The release of my last report caused quite a bit of commotion within the CERN laboratories. Security has been doubled. Everybody's work and computers are being checked and double-checked. There has even been an investigative team assigned only to find the leak. I planned for this, however. There's too many employees and networks here for them to find me just yet. For the time being, I will continue to release these reports. Following the events of Case 22-68 and the subsequent death of Dr. Stephen Welsinger, the Wuchereria Bancrofti experiments were abandoned in search of a more stable mutagen. Heading up a new research team in the R40 wing is Dr. Robert Housie. As cruel as he is brilliant, Housie made a name for himself with his sadistic work in eugenics. The goal of his early work was to cleanse the population by developing a genetic disease that would mutate to combine with genetic dispositions he deemed unfit for perfection, such as asthma, diabetes, etc. Results of his research were successful in the deaths of thousands. Setting up in African villages, he would pose as a humanitarian and administer his cures. Some credit him with a multitude of diseases in the region. Climbing quickly to almost every government's most wanted list, Housie went into hiding. Shortly after, CERN secretly recruited him, where he's been ever since. This leads us to Case 23-68 decka, with Wuchereria Bancrofti being a costly failure and little data as to why. The board of directors wanted presentations from different researchers as to why they should continue funding the decka experiments. When the board asked Housie what direction he would take as project lead, he replied, "Have you heard of Candida auris?" When the board admitted that they hadn't, all it took was 15 minutes for Housie to gain project lead. Candida auris, a living legend and the biggest fear every hospital has. This superbug in the making is resistant to most kinds of antibiotics and wouldn't take too long to culture a breed resistant to all kinds of antibiotics. It's an interesting strain, behaving more like a fungus. In its most severe cases, it can cause bacterial blockage in your blood vessels. This was an odd shot, and Housie seemed to know much more about it than anyone else. At the time, nobody asked any questions. We really should have. On November 12th, 2000,
Redacted.
one Derek and Alina Walsh were brought in. The two of them have had extensive military credentials and have far more than 10 years of military service. They were placed on separate ends of the room and forced to sit down. Housie came into the room wearing a menacing grin. This mutagen test got far worse than any of us expected. He'd bred a colony of what can only be described as beyond disturbing the length of moving plaque. A chunky, viscous pale yellow oozed off of whatever lay within the worms. Housie loaded two into one container and one into another. He looked at Alina, whose credentials were primarily in the medical field, and asked, "Have you ever heard of Candida auris?" Alina shivered. "We had an outbreak in Afghanistan. 13 men dying because we couldn't treat them," she said. Housie nodded, bringing up the cylinder that held two of the worms, and approached her. With a wry grin, he placed the cylinder onto her ear and waited while tapping the glass. The worms wriggled their way over to her with great speed, and before she could react, she was screaming from the pain of the worms. Before Derek could even get up, he was restrained by a security guard standing near him. Housie spoke again. "Derek, you know you were listed." Now restrained, Derek started yelling and fighting against the guards holding him down. The count rose to 3 guards, holding Mr. Walsh to the table as Housie put the parasite into him. Within minutes, Mr. Walsh was screaming, just like his wife. An hour passed, and the pain subsided, but now a nauseous lethargy took over their bodies. So powerful it made them incapable of speech or movement. After a half an hour had passed, function returned to their bodies, though exhaustion was extreme. Housie smiled widely on the other side of the room. Snapping his fingers, he yelled, "Containment!" In an instant, the couple were placed in restrainment gurneys and wheeled into separate rooms and left alone for 18 hours. Housie watched through the observation window as Derek struggled in his restraints. "I think he's ready," Halsey said to no one in particular. Turning a dial on the outside of the container while monitoring Derek's vitals, Halsey grinned with wild excitement. Oxygen was rapidly sucked out of the container and leveled out so that Derek's arterial oxygen partial pressure was just above a lethal 5.3 kilopascals. As hypoxia set in, Derek struggled to breathe, his skin turning a sickly blue. Before long, his skin started to bubble and expand. He fought for the breath to scream, but due to low oxygen and expanding throat, was only able to move his mouth like a fish out of water. Swelling well past abnormal, tears started appearing in his skin as it reached its threshold. With an audible pop, his skin exploded. Red splattered across the bulletproof window, mixing with white, wriggling worms streaking down. Instead of silence, a deafening screaming came from the container. Between the streaks, you can make out a silhouette of a man. Freed from his bonds, Derek's skinless body revealed the horrific results of the experiment. Since the time they were introduced through the external acoustic meatus, the worms had been feeding, multiplying, and as his skin was torn away, musculature became exposed, almost completely replacing his muscles with the pure white worms covered in his dripping gore. They acted almost symbiotically, taking the place of his muscle tissue, but also independently, writhing and moving Derek's screaming form like a colony of insects all stuck together.
Interesting. Not quite the results I was expecting,
Halsey said, trying to contain giddy laughter. Then his gaze fell upon Alina. He approached her container, inserted a key, and turned a switch. Powerful lines of electricity arced from a conduit on the wall to Alina's strapped-down feet and legs. Her shrill scream was cut off by a massive white worm erupting from her mouth. As the electricity burned and tore through the skin of her legs, frantic white squirming tissue was exposed. Struggling to get away from the arcing current, the worms making up her legs started to fold backwards towards Alina's convulsing torso. Snapping and crackling, her skeletal frame gave little resistance to the thick white things. The electricity continued shocking the retreating worms, and Alina's body began to collapse in on itself with a sickening wet splintering of bone. Before long, there was just a broken pile of bloody flesh and bone held together by still-moving muscular worms. Was all that Halsey said before pulling a large red lever that bathed the containment units in a cleansing fire.
"Prepare the next subjects,"
he said while walking away. Perhaps the sheer brutality of these experiments have blinded me from their purpose, but I have yet to see a goal or applicable use from Halsey's work here at CERN. It's like they gave a psychopath the tools and freedom to do as he pleases. The things we do here, God have mercy on us all. Until the next.
Connection.